The sound of clanking chains echoed down the dark, wet corridors of a Carthage prison. Two women were being dragged deeper and deeper into the bowels of the Roman Empire's punishment machine. One was a noblewoman, the other a slave. One held a newborn baby in her trembling arms. The other carried life still growing inside her. Yet what truly bound them together and condemned them both wasn't blood, nor social standing, nor even motherhood. It was something Rome feared even more than rebellion: Christianity. In the year 203 AD, Saints Perpetua and Felicitas would endure one of the most grotesque punishments devised by Rome. An execution so horrifying, it would stretch for hours beneath the scorching sun before a roaring crowd of thousands inside Carthage's amphitheater. But what unfolded wasn't just a tale of agony and death. It was a demonstration of fierce inner strength, of defiance in the face of overwhelming cruelty. Roman Africa in the 3rd century was boiling with unrest. Though Carthage had once stood as Rome's greatest enemy, it had since become one of its wealthiest provinces and one of the most volatile. Christianity was spreading rapidly, crossing boundaries of class and race, uniting slaves and nobles under a radical new belief: loyalty to a heavenly king rather than the emperor. This was a direct threat to Roman power. Emperor Septimius Severus, who himself had African roots, understood all too well what this movement meant. During his reign, the crackdown on Christians escalated, especially in the provinces. Local governors, eager to prove their devotion to the empire, competed with each other to stamp out this growing niche of defiance. Perpetua was born into privilege, daughter of one of Carthage's elite families. At just 22 years old, she was already a mother, educated in the classics, fluent in both Latin and Greek, and groomed to be the ideal Roman matron. But something inside her ached for more. When she discovered Christianity, it was like a light had been switched on. Finally, she had found a truth deeper than all the rituals and expectations of Roman society. Felicitas lived a very different life. She was a 20-year-old slave in Perpetua's household, 8 months pregnant and legally invisible. She had no rights, no freedom, no voice. But she had something rare: courage and intelligence. And when she heard about this new faith, this gospel of dignity, love, and redemption, she embraced it with a fervor that surprised even her mistress. For the first time in her life, she felt truly human. Becoming Christian in those days wasn't a snap decision. Converts underwent a rigorous initiation called the catechumenate, a long period of study, prayer, and preparation before baptism. Both Perpetua and Felicitas were still catechumens when their ordeal began. They likely received their baptisms in prison, if at all. They weren't alone. Others shared their faith and fate. Revocatus, Saturninus, Secundulus, and their catechist Satyrus, an elder believer who acted as their spiritual guide. Together they formed a tight-knit group, ready to face whatever the empire threw at them. It all began one morning in March, 203 AD. Roman soldiers stormed into the homes where the catechumens gathered, dragging them from their beds and ripping them from their families. The crackdown was brutal and efficient, an orchestrated display of force meant to send a clear message. Perpetua was torn away from her newborn baby. Felicitas, heavily pregnant, was shoved and beaten as she was hauled off to prison. Carthage's prison was not designed for survival. The Christians were thrown into a dungeon so dark, so suffocating, the air itself felt poisonous. Dozens of bodies crammed into spaces meant for a handful of men. No toilets, no light, no privacy. By day, the heat was unbearable. By night, the chill cut through to the bone. The prisoners were fed rotting scraps thrown onto the floor and were given so little water that thirst gnawed at them constantly. Many died before even making it to trial, and that, truthfully, was the point. But something remarkable happened in that pit of suffering. Perpetua began writing. Her prison diary, scribbled in those unspeakable conditions, would go on to become one of the most powerful pieces of early Christian literature, and one of the first surviving texts ever written by a woman in Western history. It wasn't just a record of torment. It was a document of transcendence. She described her visions, her fears, and her unwavering belief that her suffering had meaning. Her words, preserved across centuries, provide a rare and intimate glimpse into a soul preparing to meet death on her own terms. Perpetua's father, a pagan man who loved his daughter dearly, tried everything he could to save her. He visited her in prison again and again, begging her to recant, to think of her child, to think of the family's honor. In a heart-wrenching moment she described in her diary, he collapsed at her feet, not as a commanding father, but as a grieving parent calling her daughter instead of lady. But Perpetua remained unmoved, not out of coldness, but from conviction. "I cannot deny my faith," she told him, "even for you." Felicitas faced a torment all her own. According to Roman law, a pregnant woman could not be executed until after giving birth. If her labor came too late, she would be executed alone, separated from her spiritual family. This was almost worse than death. The thought of dying apart from the others crushed her spirit. So the group prayed, all of them, day and night. And just 2 days before the scheduled execution, Felicitas went into labor. What followed was a nightmare. Malnourished, dehydrated, and emotionally wrecked, she screamed in agony as her body tore itself apart in childbirth. A cruel guard mocked her cries. "If you scream like this now, what will you do when you face the beasts?" Her answer silenced him. "Now it is I who suffer," she said through clenched teeth. "But then, another will suffer in me, and for me, because I will suffer for him." That line would go down in history. The so-called trial that followed was nothing more than theater, a formality to give the illusion of justice. The man presiding over it, Procurator Hilarianus, had one job: enforce the emperor's orders, and he offered each of the Christians the same deal: make a simple sacrifice to the Roman gods and walk free. One by one, they refused. When Perpetua stood before the magistrate, he focused his appeal on the most painful point: her baby. "Think of your child," he urged. "Spare him. Spare yourself." Perpetua's reply was quiet but absolute: "I will not sacrifice." That one sentence sealed her fate. And yet, even the magistrate, trained to be cold and unsympathetic, was stunned by her calm strength. The sentence was delivered with all the flair of a public performance. The condemned would be thrown to wild beasts during the upcoming gladiatorial games held in honor of Geta, the young son of Emperor Septimius Severus. But this wasn't merely an execution. It was a public lesson, a humiliation, a warning to anyone tempted by the Christian faith. March 7th, 203 AD, the day of execution. The sky over Carthage blazed with heat as crowds surged toward the amphitheater. It was a festival of death. Vendors sold food and cheap wine. Gamblers placed bets on how long each prisoner would last. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed, as if they were going to a circus. Tens of thousands filled the stands. Nobles, merchants, laborers, all brought together by their hunger for blood. When the Christians were finally led into the arena, the crowd expected to see fear, panic, pleading. Instead, they saw something completely different. Perpetua and her companions walked in with heads held high, singing hymns, their faces radiant with peace. It was like watching people walk into a wedding rather than an execution. Perpetua refused to wear the traditional tunic of the condemned, robes that symbolized submission to the Roman gods. She insisted on dying in her own clothes, as a Christian, not a pagan. She had made that very clear to the authorities beforehand, and she would not bend now. The horror unfolded in waves. First came the men. A wild boar charged at Satyrus. Bears and leopards were unleashed on Saturninus and Revocatus. The animals, starved for days to fuel their rage, attacked with savage ferocity. Secundulus had died in prison before the games began, his death considered merciful under the circumstances. The arena thundered with screams of both man and beast. Blood soaked the sand. The crowd, once gleeful, now roared like animals themselves, drunk on carnage. Then came the women. For Perpetua and Felicitas, the organizers reserved a particularly cruel fate. A wild cow was chosen to attack them, chosen not just for its strength, but for its symbolism. Cows were sacred in certain Roman traditions, and using one added a layer of religious mockery to the violence. The beast charged. It struck Perpetua first, hurling her through the air with such force that she landed flat on her back. But even in that brutal moment, her first instinct wasn't fear. It was modesty. She quickly stood and adjusted her torn tunic to cover herself, then fixed her hair. In Roman culture, loose hair was a sign of mourning, but she refused to appear as one who mourned. She would die with dignity. Then she saw Felicitas collapsed nearby, bloodied and dazed. Without hesitation, Perpetua rushed to her, helped her stand, and steadied her. In that instant, before the jeering crowd, these two women, one noble, one slave, showed more grace than the entire empire watching them die. Something shifted in the air. The spectators, who had come for sport, began to murmur. Some looked away. Others exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't how martyrs were supposed to die. They weren't begging. They weren't cursing. They weren't even afraid. They were praying, out loud, together. What was meant to be a spectacle of shame was turning into something else entirely. Something that challenged Rome's entire narrative about Christians. This wasn't weakness. It was strength of a kind they didn't understand. The beasts had done their damage, but not enough to end it. And the show had to go on. So the executioners brought out the final act: death by sword. The Christians were gathered in the center of the arena for the final scene. They embraced one another. Some kissed, the traditional Christian kiss of peace. Then they calmly knelt down, ready. Felicitas was first. A skilled gladiator stepped forward. One swift stroke. She fell silently. Perpetua was next. But fate, in its cruelty, had given her a nervous, inexperienced executioner. His hand shook. His blade missed. Instead of a clean death, it struck her shoulder, slicing between her collarbones. Perpetua cried out. It was the first and only time during the entire ordeal that she screamed in pain. Yet even then, she didn't lose control. With blood pouring down her chest, she reached up, guided the young gladiator's hand, and placed the blade at the base of her neck. Then she nodded, and it was done. Perpetua and Felicitas died that day, but not in the way Rome intended. Their deaths didn't silence the Christian movement. They amplified it. The authorities had hoped to shame the faith, to crush it publicly with steel and fang. But what they accomplished instead was something they could never have predicted. They inspired thousands. Word of the martyrs' courage spread like wildfire. From the slums of Roman Africa to the villas of noble families, their story was whispered in secret gatherings and spoken boldly in churches. People didn't just mourn their deaths, they were moved by their lives. The dignity, the strength, the unwavering commitment. These weren't weak-minded rebels, they were heroes of conviction. And then there was the diary. Perpetua's journal, written in her own hand during her final days in prison, survived. Preserved by fellow believers, it was copied and shared throughout the empire. From Spain to Syria, Christians read her words aloud in hushed rooms, in catacombs, in hidden assemblies. It became one of the earliest and most powerful pieces of Christian literature. A personal, honest, and mystical account of a woman walking steadily toward death and finding something holy along the way. And make no mistake, this wasn't just theology. This was history. A Roman noblewoman and a pregnant slave, executed not for violence, not for treason, but for refusing to betray what they believed in. Even by the brutal standards of Rome, what happened in that arena was excessive. Yes, Rome had always been a civilization of violence. Gladiator games, executions, slavery. But this was something darker, a system so desperate to control thought and belief that it turned a religious execution into a public festival. To throw young women, one with a newborn child, another who had just given birth, into the arena, to set wild animals on them for entertainment. It was a descent into madness dressed as tradition. The Roman government wanted to display strength. Instead, they exposed their fear. Fear of an idea. Fear of a faith that couldn't be broken. Not by threats, not by suffering, not even by death. And so, what started as an attempt to erase two Christian women became a symbol of resistance for generations. The names Perpetua and Felicitas were etched into Christian memory. Their feast day would be celebrated every March 7th. Churches would be named in their honor. Children baptized with their names. Their story passed from one generation to the next, not because they were famous or powerful or wealthy, but because they chose conviction over comfort. They were different in birth. One rich, one enslaved. One educated, one illiterate. But in death, they stood side by side as equals. Their martyrdom sent a message that outlived emperors and outlasted persecution. That love and faith are stronger than swords. More than 1,800 years later, Perpetua's words still speak. Not just to believers, but to anyone who has ever faced injustice. To anyone who's ever had to choose between truth and survival. Her diary remains a rare and unfiltered look into the mind of a woman not just facing death, but meeting it with purpose. And her story asks us something uncomfortable. What kind of society takes pleasure in watching women die? What kind of civilization demands loyalty not just in action, but in belief? Rome left behind towering aqueducts, temples, law codes, but it also left behind the sound of cheering crowds as a mother was thrown to a cow. So when we ask what defines a great civilization, maybe we shouldn't just look at its monuments or its armies. Maybe we should ask how it treated the ones it feared, the ones it couldn't control, the ones who thought differently. The story of Perpetua and Felicitas isn't just ancient history. It's a reminder that even in the darkest pits, light can emerge. That even in a world built on power and fear, courage can rise in the most unexpected places, from a noblewoman with a pen and a slave with a voice. Their lives were short, their deaths were cruel, but their legacy, eternal.